My mother always had a favorite, but I never expected her final act to be a $30 million slap in the face. Yet, as my sister smugly accepted her massive fortune, the lawyer turned to a hidden, blue-sealed addendum. The secret he read next didn't just wipe the smirk off her face, it made her scream. If you want to understand the dynamics of the Davenport family, you only need to look at our childhood bedrooms in the old limestone townhouse on Boston's Beacon Hill. My sister, Harper, resided in the primary guest suite on the second floor. It was a sprawling, sun-drenched room with an ensuite bathroom lined in imported Italian marble, a walk-in closet that rivaled a luxury boutique, and a balcony overlooking the private gardens of Louisburg Square. She had custom silk curtains that were changed with the seasons and a mahogany sleigh bed fit for a European royal. I, on the other hand, slept on the fourth floor. It was a converted attic space, charming in a utilitarian sort of way, but completely isolated from the rest of the house. The floors creaked. The heating was temperamental during the brutal New England winters, and my window offered a thrilling view of the neighbor's slate roof. I am Chloe. I am the younger sister by 3 years, though you would never know it by the way we were treated. In our mother's eyes, Harper was the sun, the moon, and all the stars in the constellation. I was merely the dark matter holding the background together. Necessary, perhaps, but entirely invisible. Our mother, Eleanor Davenport, was a formidable woman. She was an heiress to a regional shipping fortune, a prominent figure in Boston high society, and a woman whose approval was as rare as a warm winter day. When our father passed away from a sudden heart attack when I was 14, Eleanor didn't collapse into grief. She simply calcified. She threw herself into managing the family trust and molding Harper into the perfect society daughter. Harper was everything our mother valued: breathtakingly beautiful, ruthlessly ambitious, and entirely superficial. By the time Harper was 22, she had married Greg Harrison, a slick venture capitalist whose smile never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. Together, they were the power couple of the local elite, constantly featured in charity gala photos and society pages. Meanwhile, I went to a state college, paid my own way through architectural school by working double shifts at a drafting firm, and rented a modest apartment in Somerville. I didn't ask my mother for a dime, and true to form, she never offered one. But when the pancreatic cancer came for Eleanor last year, it wasn't Harper who stepped up, it was me. Harper was far too overwhelmed by her social obligations and her demanding husband to deal with the ugly, messy reality of terminal illness. "I just can't bear to see Mother like that, Chloe." Harper had sniffed over the phone from her vacation home in Nantucket, clinking what sounded suspiciously like a mimosa glass. "It would absolutely break my heart. You're so much stronger with these grim things." So, I moved back into the attic of the Beacon Hill townhouse. For 8 grueling months, I was the one administering morphine drops, changing soiled sheets, and holding Eleanor's frail, skeletal hand while she screamed in pain during the darkest hours of the night. I watched the formidable, terrifying woman who had controlled my life wither away into a fragile shell. Did those 8 months soften her towards me? Did she finally recognize the devotion of her younger daughter? Not in the slightest. Even on her deathbed, heavily medicated and slipping in and out of consciousness, her mind was fixated on Harper. "Make sure Bea gets her grandmother's pearls," she would whisper, her breathing labored. "Tell Greg to sell the holding company before the market dips." When she finally passed away on a rainy Tuesday in October, I felt an overwhelming, crushing sense of relief. It was over. The physical toll, the emotional neglect, the constant striving for an approval that would never come, it was finally finished. Harper naturally put on a magnificent performance at the funeral. She wore a stunning, custom-tailored black Dior dress and wept elegantly into a lace handkerchief, leaning heavily on Greg for support. She accepted the condolences of senators and CEOs with the tragic grace of a widowed queen. I stood slightly behind her, wearing a simple black suit I'd bought off the rack 3 years ago, entirely ignored by the passing mourners. I didn't care. I was ready to close this chapter of my life. I had a good career, a kind fiancé named David who loved me for who I was, and a life entirely separate from the Davenport toxicity. I just wanted the legalities to be over so I could finally breathe. 2 weeks later, we were summoned to the offices of Pendleton, Hayes, and Sterling for the reading of the will. The law office was exactly what you would expect from a firm that managed old money. Heavy oak doors, oriental rugs that cost more than my college education, and a suffocating scent of leather bindings and lemon polish. Arthur Pendleton, the senior partner, had been our family's attorney for over 40 years. He was a stoic man in his late 60s with thinning silver hair and tortoiseshell glasses perched meticulously on the bridge of his nose. He motioned for us to sit around a massive, polished mahogany conference table. Harper sat directly across from Arthur, flanked by Greg. Greg looked like a cat who had already swallowed the canary, his bespoke suit practically vibrating with greedy anticipation. Harper sat with perfect posture, her hands folded neatly in her lap, though I caught her tapping her designer heel impatiently against the carpet. I sat at the far end of the table, as far away from them as politely possible. I didn't expect much. A small trust, perhaps. Enough to pay off my mortgage. Whatever it was, I had already promised David I wouldn't let it affect me. "Thank you all for coming," Arthur began, his voice a dry, gravelly monotone that commanded absolute attention. "Eleanor's estate is, as you know, quite substantial. She was incredibly specific about the distribution of her assets, and I must ask that you hold all questions until I have finished reading the primary document." Arthur opened a thick, cream-colored folder. For the first 20 minutes, it was a barrage of legal jargon, charitable donations to the Boston Symphony and various art museums. A generous sum of $150,000 to Maria, the housekeeper who had been with us for 2 decades. I smiled at that. Maria deserved every penny. Then, Arthur cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. The room went dead silent. "To my youngest daughter, Chloe Davenport," Arthur read, his eyes flicking up to meet mine for a brief, inscrutable second. "I leave my collection of vintage first edition literature, the Steinway grand piano located in the Beacon Hill residence, and a one-time cash disbursement of $50,000. I blinked. $50,000. It wasn't nothing, of course. For a normal person, it was a fantastic windfall. But in the context of the Davenport estate, an estate valued well over $40 million, it was a pointed, deliberate insult. It was less than what she had left the housekeeper. The piano was a cruel joke. Eleanor knew perfectly well I didn't know how to play. Harper was the one who had taken 12 years of classical lessons. Across the table, Greg let out a quiet, barely disguised scoff of amusement. Harper didn't even look at me. She simply stared intently at Arthur, waiting for the main event. I felt a hot flush of humiliation creep up my neck. I dug my fingernails into my palms, forcing my face to remain a blank, impassive mask. "Don't let them see you hurt," I repeated in my head like a mantra. "Don't give them the satisfaction." And to my eldest daughter, Harper Harrison, Arthur continued, his voice echoing in the tense silence of the room, "I leave the remainder of my estate. This includes the Beacon Hill townhouse, the Nantucket estate, the family's majority shares in the Davenport Holding Corporation, and all remaining liquid assets held in the primary trust." Arthur paused, looking down at the paperwork. "At the time of Eleanor's passing, the total valuation of Harper's inheritance is approximately $32,400,000. $32 million. Harper let out a long, theatrical exhale, pressing a hand to her chest as if she had been holding her breath. She turned to Greg, who practically had dollar signs spinning in his eyes. They shared a look of absolute, unadulterated triumph. It was the look of two people who had just won the lottery and were already mentally spending it on yachts and private jets. "Mother always knew who was equipped to handle the legacy," Harper murmured softly, though loudly enough for me to hear. She finally looked down the table at me, her eyes brimming with a cloying, fake sympathy. "Don't worry, Chloe. Greg and I will make sure you're invited to Thanksgiving at the townhouse. We won't forget about you." I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up, flip the heavy mahogany table, and demand to know why 8 months of changing bedpans and holding back vomit and offering comfort to a dying woman meant absolutely nothing in the face of Harper's golden, untouchable status. But I stayed silent. I slowly stood up, grabbing my purse. If that's all, Arthur, I'll be going. Sit down, Chloe, Arthur commanded. It wasn't a request. The sudden sharpness in his voice made both Harper and Greg snap their heads toward him. Arthur placed the thick cream-colored will to the side. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a bright blue wax-sealed envelope. It looked entirely out of place among the drab legal documents. I am not finished, Arthur said, his gaze hardening. What I just read was Eleanor's primary will, drafted 5 years ago. However, 3 days before her death, while Chloe was out picking up her medications, Eleanor summoned me to the house. She dictated and signed a legally binding codicil, a final condition regarding Harper's inheritance. Harper's smile vanished. A condition? What kind of condition? Mother never mentioned a condition to me. Eleanor was a very private woman, Harper, Arthur replied coldly. He broke the wax seal with a silver letter opener. The sound seemed deafening in the quiet room. He pulled out a single sheet of heavy, watermarked paper. This codicil activates immediately upon the reading of the primary will, Arthur explained, looking directly at my sister. You have legally been bequeathed the $32 million, Harper. The assets are officially in your name as of this exact moment, which makes you the sole owner of the Davenport Holding Corporation. Okay, Harper said slowly, her guard up. So, what is the problem? Arthur didn't answer her directly. He looked down at the paper and began to read Eleanor's final devastating words. To my golden child, Harper, I give you exactly what you have always wanted. Everything. You are now the sole owner of the Davenport fortune. But with my wealth, you must also inherit my sins. Harper frowned, exchanging a confused, slightly panicked look with Greg. What is she talking about, Arthur? Arthur ignored her, his voice rising in volume as he read the next paragraph. For the past 8 years, with the full documented complicity of your husband, Greg, the Davenport Holding Corporation has been operating as a massive, illegal offshore tax haven and money laundering front for the syndicates operating out of the ports. I knew Greg was stealing. I knew he was laundering. But my secret, Harper, is that I let him do it, and I put all the shell companies in your name. The color violently drained from Harper's face. She looked like she had just been struck by lightning. 3 days ago, Arthur continued reading, entirely unbothered by the sheer terror blooming in the room. I handed over 70 gigabytes of decrypted financial ledgers, emails, and forged signatures to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I confessed to everything, and in exchange for my posthumous cooperation, they granted full immunity to Chloe, who knew nothing, and focused their entire investigation on the newly minted sole owner of the corrupt estate. Arthur slowly lowered the paper. He looked at Harper, who was trembling so violently, her chair was vibrating. The $32 million is yours, Harper, Arthur said quietly, along with roughly $60 million in federal fines, back taxes, and a mountain of irrefutable evidence that Greg has been laundering cartel money through your personal accounts. Arthur glanced at his gold Rolex. In fact, Arthur noted, Eleanor insisted I read this at exactly 3:00 p.m. today. She coordinated the timing with the U.S. Attorney's Office. Right on cue, the heavy oak doors of the conference room burst open. 4 men in dark windbreakers with the letters FBI emblazoned in bright yellow on the back stepped into the room, their badges raised. Harper looked at the agents, then at Greg, who was backing away toward the window in sheer panic, and finally at the blue envelope on the table. And then, my perfect golden sister opened her mouth and unleashed a blood-curdling, agonizing scream. Harper's scream didn't sound human. It was a jagged, visceral sound that tore through the sterile silence of the law office, bouncing off the mahogany panels and rattling the crystal water pitchers. It was the sound of a woman watching her entire fabricated reality disintegrate in real time. The 4 FBI agents moved with terrifying, practiced efficiency. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man whose badge identified him as Special Agent Richard Miller, stepped past the heavy oak doors and positioned himself between Greg and the exit. Harper Harrison and Gregory Harrison. Agent Miller's voice was remarkably calm, contrasting sharply with the absolute pandemonium he had just unleashed. You are both under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. Greg, whose arrogant smirk had completely evaporated, held up his hands. His face was the color of old parchment. Wait, 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 he stammered, his voice cracking an octave higher than usual. There's a mistake. A massive mistake. I didn't sign anything. The holding company is entirely in my wife's name. Harper is the sole proprietor. I watched, utterly paralyzed in my chair, as Greg the man Harper had paraded around like a prize stallion for the better part of a decade, instantly threw her straight under the oncoming train. Harper stopped screaming, her mouth hanging open as she stared at her husband in horrified disbelief. Greg? What are you saying? I'm saying I'm just an advisor, Greg practically shrieked, backing away from her as if she were suddenly radioactive. He looked at Agent Miller, his eyes wide with desperate cowardice. She's the CEO on paper. Her mother set it up. Eleanor and Harper ran the trust. I was just a consultant. I didn't know where the capital was coming from. Arthur Pendleton, who had remained seated with his hands calmly folded over the explosive codicil, let out a dry, humorless chuckle. A valiant, if pathetic, effort, Greg, Arthur said, his voice dripping with aristocratic disdain. Unfortunately for you, Eleanor's 70 gigabytes of evidence included hundreds of encrypted emails between you and the shell company directors, as well as audio recordings of you instructing Harper on exactly where to sign the fraudulent tax returns. Eleanor had the townhouse bugged for the last 3 years of her life. Greg's knees physically buckled. He collapsed into one of the leather chairs, burying his face in his hands as a second agent moved forward, the metallic clack-clack of handcuffs echoing in the room. Chloe Davenport? I jumped as Agent Miller turned his attention to me. I nodded slowly, my throat completely dry. Your mother's legal counsel arranged for your federal immunity prior to her passing, Miller said, his tone softening just a fraction. We know you had no involvement or knowledge of the financial structure of the Davenport estate. You're free to go, ma'am. We'll need a formal statement eventually, but for now, you should leave. I stood up on trembling legs. I grabbed my coat and my purse, my brain struggling to process the sheer magnitude of what had just transpired. My mother, bedridden and dying, had orchestrated a federal sting operation from her mattress. She had mathematically calculated the exact moment to drop the guillotine on the golden child and her parasitic husband. As I walked toward the door, Harper lunged out of her chair. "Chloe, help me!" she sobbed, her manicured hands grasping desperately at my coat sleeve. Her perfect hair was wild, her mascara running in dark, ugly streaks down her cheeks. "Please, you have to tell them. Tell them I didn't know. Tell them Mother was crazy." I looked down at the sister who had ignored me my entire life. The sister who had sipped mimosas in Nantucket while I emptied bedpans and held our mother through the agonizing twilight of her cancer. I looked at the sheer terror in her eyes, finally understanding the true cost of being Eleanor Davenport's favorite. "She wasn't crazy, Bea," I said quietly, gently pulling my arm out of her grip. "She just finally gave you exactly what you deserved." I walked out of the conference room, leaving the sounds of Greg's weeping and Harper's frantic pleas behind me. When I reached the lobby, I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the crisp Boston air. My fiancé, David, was waiting by the curb in his beat-up Subaru. When he saw my face, he immediately killed the engine and jumped out. "Chloe, what happened? Are you okay?" He wrapped his arms around me, and the moment I felt the warmth of his chest, the shock broke. I didn't cry for my mother. I didn't cry for Harper. I cried from the sheer, overwhelming exhaustion of surviving the Davenport family. "She gave Harper everything," I whispered into David's shoulder. "She gave her everything, David, and it's going to destroy her." The fallout was spectacular, catastrophic, and deeply public. Within 48 hours, the Davenport downfall was the front-page story of the Boston Globe. The sheer scale of the money laundering was staggering. Greg hadn't just been skimming off the top. He had effectively turned my family's generational wealth into a clearinghouse for a prominent East Coast narcotics syndicate. The federal government moved with ruthless speed. Because Harper was the sole legal owner of the estate, a trap my mother had painstakingly laid over the course of 5 years, every single asset she inherited was immediately frozen and seized under RICO laws. The Beacon Hill townhouse, the Nantucket estate, the offshore accounts, the vintage cars, The designer jewelry, all of it belonged to the feds now. Greg was denied bail, deemed an extreme flight risk, and remanded to a federal penitentiary in Rhode Island. He immediately tried to cut a plea deal, but my mother's evidence was so meticulous and devastatingly thorough that the prosecutors didn't need him. Harper, stripped of her wealth, her credit cards, and her social standing overnight, was forced to move into a cheap, extended-stay motel in Revere. The society friends who used to clamor for her attention dropped her instantly. She called me twice during those first few weeks, leaving hysterical, venomous voicemails accusing me of being in on the conspiracy. I changed my number. 6 months passed. The snow melted, spring arrived in Boston, and the chaos slowly faded into a dull, manageable hum. I married David in a small, beautiful ceremony at a botanical garden. We didn't invite a single person from my past life. One Tuesday afternoon, I received an unexpected phone call from Agent Miller. "Mrs. Harris," Miller said, using my new married name, "the Asset Forfeiture Division is preparing to auction off the contents of the Beacon Hill property next week. However, the legal department flagged your name. According to the will, you were bequeathed a specific set of items before the estate was seized. We need you to come collect them, or they go to the auction block." "The books and the piano," I murmured, remembering the meager, insulting inheritance that had saved me from federal prison. "Correct," Miller said. "I can meet you there tomorrow at noon to supervise the extraction." I didn't want to go back to that house, but David, always the voice of quiet reason, encouraged me. "Those first editions are valuable, Chloe, and a Steinway is a beautiful instrument. We can sell them and put the money toward a down payment on a house. Don't let the government take what is legally yours." So, the next day, I found myself standing in the foyer of the Beacon Hill townhouse. The air was stale, the furniture covered in thick layers of dust. The silence of the house was oppressive, stripped of the vibrant, toxic energy my mother and sister used to fill it with. Agent Miller walked me to the library on the first floor. It took 2 hours for the professional movers I'd hired to carefully dismantle the legs of the massive black Steinway and load it into their climate-controlled truck. Once they were gone, I was left alone in the library to pack the books. There were hundreds of them, beautiful, leather-bound first editions of Dickens, Tolstoy, Hemingway, and Fitzgerald. My mother had loved these books. They were the only things she had ever treated with genuine, gentle care. I was halfway through packing the third box when I reached for a heavy, immaculately preserved 1925 first edition of F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. As I pulled it from the mahogany shelf, the book felt strangely unbalanced. It was far too light for its size. Frowning, I opened the cover. It wasn't a book at all. It was a masterfully crafted dummy box, bound in authentic vintage leather to perfectly match the rest of the collection. Inside the hollowed-out center lay 2 items, a heavy, ornate brass key with a string of numbers engraved on the bow, and a thick envelope with my name written on it in my mother's unmistakable, elegant cursive. My heart hammered against my ribs. I sat down heavily in the dusty leather armchair, my fingers trembling as I broke the seal on the envelope. The letter inside was dated just 2 weeks before she died. "Chloe, if you are reading this, the worst is over. The storm has broken, the rot has been burned away, and you have finally returned to this house to claim what is yours. I know you hate me. I do not blame you. I was a terrible mother to you. I was cold, demanding, and utterly devoid of the warmth you so desperately craved, but I was never blind. I saw Greg for what he was the moment Harper brought him home, a parasite disguised in custom tailoring. I knew he was stealing, but I also knew your sister. Harper is weak, Chloe. She is entirely dependent on the illusion of luxury and the approval of others. If I had simply cut Greg out, she would have played the martyr and stayed with him, slowly bleeding my legacy dry while pretending to be a victim. I could not allow that. The Davenport name was built on iron, not silk. If Harper wanted the crown so badly, I decided to let her wear it right into the guillotine. But you, Chloe, you are the iron. You survived my neglect, You built a life for yourself out of sheer willpower, and when I was rotting away, stripped of my dignity and my power, you were the only one who stayed. Not out of greed, but out of a misplaced, beautiful sense of duty. I could not leave you the Davenport fortune. Greg had thoroughly infected the primary trusts, and leaving you any portion of it would have dragged you into the federal nightmare I orchestrated for them. I had to leave you nothing, so that the world and the law would believe you were truly cast out. But I am not a fool, and I do not leave my debts unpaid. The key in this box belongs to a private vault at the Geneva branch of Credit Suisse. It was opened in 1982 by your grandfather, completely disconnected from the Davenport Holding Corporation. It has never been audited, and Greg never knew it existed. Inside, you will find bearer bonds and clean, untraceable assets valued at approximately $6 million. It is not $30 million, but it is clean, it is safe, and it is yours. Take it. Build your life with David. Never look back at this family, and never apologize for surviving us. Eleanor. I sat in the silence of the dusty library, the letter shaking in my hands. A single tear escaped my eye, cutting a warm path down my cheek, followed by a second and a third. I wasn't crying out of grief. I was crying out of a profound, overwhelming sense of awe. My mother had spent her final months not just plotting the destruction of the people who had wronged her, but painstakingly shielding the one daughter she actually respected. She had given Harper the glittering, poisoned apple, and she had hidden the true legacy in the shadows exactly where she knew I would be waiting. I folded the letter, slipped the brass key into my pocket, and stood up. I looked around the library one last time, feeling the ghosts of the Davenport family finally release their grip on my chest. "Ready to go, Mrs. Harris?" Agent Miller asked, poking his head into the room. I smiled, picking up the last box of books. "Yes, Agent Miller," I said, my voice steadier than it had been in years. "I'm finally ready to go home." The flight to Geneva 2 weeks later felt like a surreal dream. David and I sat in Coach Old Habits Die Hard, watching the tracker on the seatback screen as we crossed the Atlantic. I kept my hand in my coat pocket the entire flight, my fingers tracing the cold, heavy brass of the safety deposit key. We arrived at the Credit Suisse branch on the Place de Bel Air on a crisp, overcast Thursday morning. The bank was a fortress of limestone and polished granite, exuding that quiet, intimidating aura of old European money. We were escorted by a meticulously tailored associate named Thomas Arrington down into the subterranean vaults. "Vault 4208, Thomas said, his voice hushed in the cavernous, echoing room. He inserted the bank's master key into the left lock, stepped back, and gestured for me to proceed. My hand shook as I slid my mother's brass key into the right lock. It turned with a heavy, satisfying click. Inside the long metal drawer was a simple leather briefcase. We carried it to a private viewing room, the heavy steel door sealing us in absolute silence. When David popped the brass latches, we didn't find stacks of cinematic cash or gold bars. We found neat, organized bundles of bearer bonds, alongside a series of certified deeds to land parcels in the Pacific Northwest, and a ledger of diversified, blue-chip stocks that had been quietly compounding dividends since the Reagan administration. My grandfather had started the account. My mother had shielded it. It was completely quarantined from Greg's cartel poison. We didn't keep it a secret, and we certainly didn't hide it offshore. I hired a relentless tax attorney in Boston named Sarah Jenkins. We spent the next 6 months legally repatriating every single asset, paying the heavy capital gains penalties and federal taxes with a cheerful willingness that absolutely baffled the IRS agents handling the Davenport fallout. By the time the government took their rightful cut, the $6 million had become roughly $3.5 million. It was still more money than David and I could spend in a lifetime. We bought a beautiful, rambling farmhouse in the Hudson Valley, surrounded by 80 acres of ancient oak trees. I used a portion of the funds to open my own boutique architectural firm, taking on projects that actually mattered to me: affordable, sustainable housing designs rather than the soulless corporate monoliths I used to draft. We adopted 2 rescue mutts. We breathed clean air. We slept soundly. As for the golden child, Harper's descent was a slow, agonizing public spectacle. Greg's trial was the media circus of the decade. United States versus Gregory Harrison, dragged all the Davenport skeletons into the harsh light of day. Facing decades in federal prison, Greg attempted to leverage his knowledge of the cartel's operations for a reduced sentence. The cartel's lawyers, however, were far more terrifying than the U.S. Attorney's Office. In the end, Greg pleaded guilty to a mountain of charges and was sentenced to 14 years at the Allenwood Low Security Penitentiary in Pennsylvania. Harper, miraculously, avoided a prison cell. Because my mother had intentionally orchestrated the paper trail to show Harper was manipulated and deliberately kept in the dark by Greg, her criminal defense attorney managed to secure a deferred prosecution agreement. But staying out of prison did not save her from the financial guillotine. The IRS held Harper personally liable for the years of fraudulent tax returns she had blindly signed. The Civil Asset Forfeiture Division stripped her down to the studs. They took the townhouse, the cars, her shares, her offshore accounts, and even her personal jewelry collection, claiming it was all purchased with laundered funds. They left her with absolutely nothing but a staggering, insurmountable mountain of debt. The society friends who used to drink her expensive champagne and clamor for her attention ghosted her with breathtaking speed. In the brutal, transactional world of high society, Harper had gone from royalty to a radioactive liability overnight. 3 years after the will reading, I found myself back in Boston. I was in town for an architectural conference and had a few hours to kill before my train back to New York. A sudden, violent New England rainstorm forced me to take shelter in a massive, high-end department store on Boylston Street. I was wandering through the glaring, mirrored aisles of the ground-floor cosmetics department, shaking the rain from my umbrella, when I saw her. She was standing behind a glass counter displaying luxury skincare creams. She was wearing the store's standard, stiff black uniform. Her hair, once perfectly styled by exclusive Newbury Street salons, was pulled back in a severe, practical ponytail. It was Harper. I froze, stepping behind a display of mannequins. I watched my older sister, the woman who had slept in Italian silk and sneered at my state college degree, assist a demanding, sharply dressed customer. The customer was unhappy with a foundation match. She was speaking to Harper with that specific, degrading tone of voice reserved for people viewed as the help. I watched Harper's face. In the past, Harper would have eviscerated the woman with a single, cutting remark. But the Harper behind the counter just swallowed hard, forced a tight plastic smile, and apologized profusely. She reached for a tissue to wipe a smudge off the glass. And I noticed her hands. They weren't the soft, perfectly manicured hands of a wealthy heiress anymore. The nails were trimmed short, the cuticles dry and cracked from constant hand-washing and working retail hours. A sharp, unexpected pang of pity hit my chest. It would have been so easy to walk over there, to buy a $300 jar of face cream from her, just to see the look of humiliation in her eyes, to offer her a few $100s out of spite, to finally, definitively rub my victory in her face. But as I looked at her, I realized something profound. If I did that, I would be acting exactly like Eleanor. I would be perpetuating the very same cycle of cruelty and dominance that had poisoned our family for generations. My mother had given Harper the crown she so desperately wanted, knowing it was made of lead and would drown her. Eleanor's revenge was absolute, brilliant, and utterly ruthless. But I didn't have to carry that ruthlessness forward. I was the iron, just as my mother had said. And iron is meant to build foundations, not weapons. I took a slow breath, letting the chaotic ghosts of Beacon Hill wash over me one final time, and then I let them go. I turned around, walked out the sliding glass doors into the pouring rain, and never looked back. In the end, the money didn't matter as much as the truth it exposed. My mother's final secret dismantled the false reality Harper had built her entire life upon. Walking away from that Boston department store, and eventually from Harper herself, I left behind the lies and the toxic Davenport legacy. For the first time, I wasn't the shadow. I was free, and that peace is truly priceless.